Anyone with their head screws on understands that however we achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians, that is going to have to take a format that is less than full sovereignty and full statehood, because that would represent an existential threat to Israel.
This is a particularly terrible number, really. The Hamas-run health ministry says that more than 25,000 people have now been killed in Gaza during Israel's offensive there. The weekend was one of the deadliest with very heavy fighting. The Israeli Prime Minister rejected the notion of a Palestinian state once again this weekend. But what is the alternative long term? Let's speak to Eylon Levy, spokesperson for Israel's Prime Minister. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How do you feel when you confront that number, 25,000 people dead?
Clearly, deeply upsetting. We didn't want this war. We didn't start this war. We are outraged that Hamas launched this war with the October 7 massacre and is choosing to fight this war from inside populated areas where it is trying to use civilians as human shields. And that's why we have been going to such lengths to try to minimize civilian casualties in a counter-terror battlefield that no army has ever had to confront, giving warning for people to evacuate, securing humanitarian corridors, trying to get people out of harm's way. And we hope that Hamas will take the option to surrender, release the hostages, lay down its arms, and turn over its war criminals for a tribunal so that this can end and we can begin the post-Hamas era sooner rather than later.
Do you concede at all that you could have kept more people safe?
Look, clearly every civilian casualty is a tragedy, and we don't in any way want to minimize that. We don't want to see civilians being hurt, but it is important to understand the nature of the battlefield in which we are fighting, a battlefield in which Hamas has spent 16 years deliberately embedding itself under civilian areas. According to the New York Times, the entire Hamas tunnel network under the Gaza Strip could be up to 70% longer than the London Underground. That is the nature of Hamas's strategy to embed its military infrastructure under civilian areas. And if those Hamas figures are true, which we very much doubt, and if the Israeli figures are true indeed, that over 9,000 Hamas terrorists have been killed, you are talking about a civilian to combatant ratio that is far, far lower than anything achieved by other Western armies in other counterterrorism battles in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in ISIS. I've never been able to find accurate figures for the number of civilians killed in those wars, but it would appear that the proportion in those wars was much higher, and the numbers, tragic, shocking, horrific as they are, will show very clearly the lengths the Israeli army has gone to try to minimize casualties, while Hamas is trying to maximize them. Unfortunately, that is the sick nature of its human shield strategy.
But Eylon Levy, if that number continues to go up, let's say 50,000, at what point does it just become unjustifiable?
We are fighting at the moment to bring back the hostages who we know are being tortured and raped in the Hamas terror dungeons, and to make sure that Hamas can never do this again. We wish that we had an option to simply pull back and make this problem go away, wave a magic wand and pretend that Hamas won't attack us again. But the first thing that Hamas did after it brutally massacred 1,200 people and took 253 people hostage is to tell us that it wants to do it again and again. So we understand we have no choice to fight, and that's why we think that anyone who wants to bring this war to a speedy end, as we do, should be calling on Hamas to surrender.
You said there that the hostages are currently being tortured and raped. What evidence do you have of that?
We have testimonies from the survivors of captivity, things they witnessed, hostages who are touched, things that they saw, doctors who are speaking about survivors who either experienced or witnessed sexual abuse. We're being very careful not to say anything that the survivors and the doctors themselves have not already been telling the media, but the evidence of physical, psychological, and sexual abuse in the Hamas terror dungeons is a matter of grave concern for the whole of Israeli society, and that is why we desperately want to get all those hostages back immediately, because time has run out for them.
In the past few days, Prime Minister Netanyahu has publicly rejected the US push for a future Palestinian state. He's been fiercely opposed to a Palestinian state throughout his political career. We know that. But are there, I don't know, I mean, are you comfortable with that? I know you're his spokesperson, but are you comfortable with an all-out, no, we cannot have a Palestinian state? Or do you see any circumstances in which you would accept that?
Well, I could try to explain the Prime Minister's thinking. The Prime Minister's position is that the Palestinians should have all the rights to govern themselves and none of the rights to commit massacres like they did on October 7th. We think they should govern themselves. That is absolutely right. But we do not think that they should have a staging ground from which to commit further attacks. And there is a widespread fear in Israel that a Palestinian state in the mountains overlooking Tel Aviv and surrounding Jerusalem, that would leave Israel only 9 miles wide at the narrowest, wouldn't end the conflict. They would in fact be a staging ground for further attacks. What does statehood mean? Would statehood mean the Palestinians have the right to sign a mutual defense treaty with Iran? Would it mean that they can hold joint military exercises with Hezbollah? Would it mean that they can import weapons from North Korea? I think anyone with their head screws on understands that however we achieve a secure peace with the Palestinians, that is going to have to take a format that is less than full sovereignty and full statehood, because that would represent an existential threat to Israel. Unfortunately, Palestinian polls show that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the West Bank think that the October 7 massacre was the correct decision by Hamas, despite everything that has happened since. And we think that in order for there to be peace, which we very much want with our neighbors, there needs to be a serious push towards de-radicalization, towards ending the ideology within Palestinian society of from the river to the sea, the total objection to the idea of a state of Israel, because otherwise the creation of a Palestinian state is not going to solve the conflict. It would only fuel it. And many people in Israel will be saying that calls for a two-state solution, in fact, reward terrorism. And if the response to the October 7 massacre is in fact to cede more territory, then that will show that terrorism works and not that it's a dead end.
Okay. You talked about about the Palestinians in the West Bank and their support for what happened on October the 7th. Do you also accept that Palestinians in the West Bank have been attacked themselves since October the 7th?
Well, since October 7th, Hamas has been trying to escalate this conflict. We know that
I understand
October
that, but
7th,
that wasn't my question. It was just, do you concede that some of the Palestinians in the West Bank have been attacked by civilians?
wherever there is case of vigilante violence or hooliganism, we completely condemn it. There is no room for that, no room for anyone who wants to take the law into their own hands or conduct acts of violence. We take very strongly our obligations as a law-abiding democracy and completely reject and treat very firmly any such allegations.
Okay, that is Eylon Levy. He is spokesperson for Israel's Prime Minister.